That is the number of workers Starbucks filed to lay off in Seattle and Kent on October 9, 2025. One more notice submitted to the Washington State Employment Security Department, effective December 5th of that year. 6 days before that filing, on October 3rd, the company had already filed a separate notice covering 338 more workers across Washington state, over 1,300 positions. In a matter of weeks, at the company that put Seattle on the commercial map, picture this: outside the Reserve Roastery on Capitol Hill, drizzle on a Thursday afternoon, a crowd of workers in green aprons holding signs in the dark. 3 years of strikes, hundreds of picket lines, thousands of hours. The company they pressured for a contract. The city that cheered them on. And now the jobs are not going to another neighborhood or the suburbs. They are going to Tennessee. How Seattle became this. Understanding how Seattle arrived at this moment requires going back to April 1st, 2015. That is the date Seattle's minimum wage ordinance took effect, starting the clock on what became the most watched wage experiment in American municipal history. The floor for most workers started at $11 an hour. The stated goal was gradual escalation, pegged to inflation and cost of living, until the city reached $15. Seattle reached $15. Then it kept going. By January 1st, 2026, every employer in Seattle, regardless of size, was required to pay a minimum wage of $21.30 per hour. Tips do not count toward that number. Medical benefits do not count toward it. That is a 94% increase from the 2015 floor in just over a decade, and the ordinance mandates another increase on January 1st, 2027. Researchers at the University of Washington studied the 2015 ordinance and found something the city did not publicize widely. The increase in earnings for Seattle's low-wage workers, the people the law was written to help, amounted to $72 extra per quarter, not per week, per quarter, because, as the researchers put it, the effects of disemployment appear to be roughly offsetting the gain in hourly wage rates. Higher pay per hour, fewer hours worked, net gain, about $24 a month. The minimum wage was the foundation. The city built a tax structure on top of it. In 2020, Seattle passed the Payroll Expense Tax, officially called the Jumpstart Tax. It required businesses with total Seattle payroll above a set threshold to pay a percentage of compensation paid to high earners. By 2024, the threshold stood at $8.5 million in Seattle payroll, and the tax applied to wages above $182,385 per year. For companies like Amazon, Microsoft, and Starbucks, headquartered in the city, paying thousands of engineers well above that threshold, the exposure was substantial. Seattle's own chief economist later acknowledged the outcome plainly. As the Bellevue Chamber of Commerce joint statement from April 2025 put it, businesses respond to incentives. They did. Seattle's payroll expense tax collections came in 18.5% below budget projections for both 2025 and 2026. Business and occupation tax revenues dropped year over year in 2024, with projections revised further downward. Sales and use tax collections were flat year over year despite inflation. The Bellevue Chamber, the Association of Washington Business, the Seattle Metropolitan Chamber, and the Washington Roundtable issued a joint statement. BHAO and payroll expense tax are down, sales tax is flat, and all three of these major revenue sources for the city are forecasted to come in under budget this year and next. What makes this particularly sharp is the geographic precision of the damage. Amazon shifted jobs not to another state, to Bellevue, a 15-minute drive across Lake Washington. Analysts documented Seattle losing 5,800 jobs while Bellevue gained 4,400 in the same period. The jobs did not disappear. They moved just far enough to avoid the tax. The Starbucks timeline. Starbucks did not arrive in isolation. The company had been through a brutal stretch before any of this. Global same-store sales had declined for multiple consecutive quarters. CEO Laxman Narasimhan was ousted in August 2024. Brian Niccol, the former Chipotle executive credited with stabilizing that chain after its food safety crisis, was brought in with a restructuring mandate he called Back to Starbucks. The cost, $1 billion in training, store upgrades, and operational changes. That restructuring had a geographic dimension Seattle did not immediately account for. On October 3, 2025, Starbucks filed a WARN notice covering 338 workers. Reason listed, closure. 6 days later, October 9th, the second notice, 974 workers in Seattle and Kent, effective December 5th. The closures included some of Starbucks' most visible Seattle locations: the Capitol Hill Reserve Roastery, a flagship store, a tourist destination, a union shop that had organized in 2022, closed. The Soto Reserve store closed. Starbucks closed a location inside Seattle Children's Hospital. In total, the company shut 31 Washington locations across this wave. Starbucks said of the Reserve Roastery, "We don't see a path to financial performance." 5 words that carry more weight than any press release. Here is where the resentment lives. The workers who had been striking since 2022, demanding staffing protections, better pay, basic scheduling stability, had organized in the genuine belief that political pressure would force the company to the table. They had the city council on their side. They had labor lawyers. They had media coverage. What they did not have was a contract. 3 years on the picket line, and effective December 5, 2025, hundreds of them had neither a contract nor a job. The mayor. On November 13, 2025, Mayor Bruce Harrell conceded the Seattle mayoral race to Mayor-elect Katie Wilson. Wilson had run on a pro-labor platform, positioning herself to the left of Harrell on housing, policing, and worker protections. Hours after Harrell conceded, not days, not a week, Mayor-elect Wilson traveled to the picket line outside the shuttered Reserve Roastery on Capitol Hill. In front of striking workers and allied labor groups, she said in her exact words, "That is why I am proud to join them on their picket line and proud to say loud and clear, I am not buying Starbucks and you should not either." She then led the crowd in a chant. When workers' rights are under attack, what do? Stand up, fight back. No meeting with CEO Brian Niccol, no call with Seattle City Finance team, no review of what Starbucks' 8,000-plus Seattle employees contributed to the city's payroll tax base. Her first public act after winning the Seattle mayoralty, at the precise moment the company had already begun filing mass layoff notices, was to call for a consumer boycott of that company. None of that changes the fact that Starbucks had already been making decisions about its footprint long before Wilson took office. But what a mayor-elect says on camera has meaning. Markets notice. Boards of directors notice. Corporate real estate teams notice. The Nashville Announcement. On April 21, 2026, Starbucks Chief Partner Officer Sarah Kelly sent a message to the company's workforce. The subject: Nashville. Starbucks would invest $100 million in a new support office in Nashville, Tennessee. Over 5 years, the facility would employ 2,000 workers. The roles would include new hires, insourced work previously contracted out, and the transfer of select teams from Seattle, including sourcing teams that had already relocated. A temporary Nashville building would open in May 2026. The permanent facility would be complete in 2027. At an average salary of $125,000 per year, those 2,000 positions represent approximately $250 million in annual wages flowing into Tennessee's economy instead of Washington's. Those 2,000 no personal income tax. Washington State in 2025 enacted a 9.9% tax on individuals earning over $1 million annually. At least 6 Starbucks executive officers earned over $6 million in total compensation in fiscal year 2025 alone, according to the company's 2026 proxy statement. The arithmetic is not difficult. Visual note: side-by-side state income tax comparison, Washington 9.9% versus Tennessee 0.0%. What makes this particularly sharp is the sequence. This was not an announcement made in spite of Seattle's political climate. Starbucks had been telegraphing the departure for months. In July 2025, the company required remote employees to return to the Seattle office 4 days a week, or be terminated. That return to office mandate was followed almost immediately by the October 2025 layoff filings. Then in March 2026, the Nashville office was first publicly named. Then April, $100 million confirmed. 2,000 jobs, 5 years. One Starbucks corporate employee told Business Insider, "It's just confusing because last year the message was to be in the office in Seattle for office culture, and now they've introduced this new mini HQ." The buy moment. Understanding how Mayor Wilson arrived at the response that circulated widely requires knowing what Washington State had just done. In April 2026, state lawmakers in Olympia enacted a 9.9% capital gains and high income tax on individuals earning over $1 million annually. On April 14, 2026, Mayor Wilson appeared at a forum at Seattle University. An attendee asked her directly about the concern that wealthy residents might leave the state in response to the new tax. Her response: a wave of her hand and the word "buy." That single gesture, recorded, shared, replayed, became the frame through which the Starbucks Nashville announcement was then read. 9 days before the dismissal, she had been on a picket line calling for a boycott. Now she was waving off the tax base those high earners represented. By May 4, 2026, the Washington Post's editorial board had published a piece under the headline, "Seattle's Mayor Waves Goodbye to Prosperity." The New York Post described Wilson as Seattle's socialist mayor in their May 4th coverage. The Seattle Times, not a conservative outlet, reported on May 2nd, "The gaffes are becoming a pattern for Seattle's new mayor." Wilson's office, in response to the Starbucks Nashville announcement, issued a statement calling Starbucks a core part of Seattle's identity and said the city was focused on maintaining a strong partnership with leadership, the same leadership she had not contacted before standing on their workers' picket line and calling for a consumer boycott 5 months earlier. No program sustains itself against math like that. Here's where it gets worse. The Starbucks story is the headline. It is not the full picture. Seattle's April 2026 Economic and Revenue Forecast, published by the city's Office of Economic and Revenue Forecasts, documented that taxable sales in the construction sector declined 4.4% in 2025. Consumer spending ran weaker than the national average. The forecast noted that under a pessimistic scenario, general fund revenues would fall approximately 5% below the baseline, with payroll expense tax and real estate excise tax showing the largest gaps. Amazon filed warn notices covering 1,087 layoffs in Seattle in late 2025, 2303 statewide. The concern among fiscal analysts was not only the job losses themselves, but the compounding effect on the payroll expense tax, which depends disproportionately on a small number of very large, very high-wage employers. When those employers cut headcount or shift teams to Bellevue or Nashville, the city's revenue math deteriorates faster than the budget models anticipated. In 2024, payroll expense tax collections already came in $47 million below projections. The city acknowledged this, and yet Washington state lawmakers in Olympia, rather than recalibrate, moved in 2025 to extend a version of Seattle's payroll tax statewide. The same mechanism that produced $47 million in shortfalls in its own home city was proposed as a model for the rest of Washington state. Washington is projected to lose $750 million in tax revenue over the next 2 decades as high earners leave, a projection calculated before the Starbucks Nashville announcement. That number will need to be revised. Root cause analysis. What happened to those Starbucks workers, the ones who organized in 2022, struck dozens of times, never secured a contract, and then lost their jobs effective December 5, 2025, is not explained cleanly by any single policy decision. Starbucks had real operational problems independent of Seattle's policy environment. Revenue had been declining before any local tax entered the equation. Nichols' restructuring was driven by shareholder pressure and a company that had overextended its menu, its store count, and its labor model simultaneously. The customer behavior shift post-pandemic hit high-price coffee harder than most categories. These were company-level failures, not city-level failures, but the policy environment accelerated every exit decision. At $21.30 per hour minimum wage, the highest mandatory floor of any major American city, plus the payroll expense tax on high earners, plus a new state income tax of 9.9% on million-dollar incomes, the cost differential between operating in Seattle and operating in Nashville was not marginal. Starbucks saves an estimated $12,000 per employee per year from the tax environment difference between Tennessee and Washington alone. Multiply that by 2,000 employees, $24 million per year. Over 5 years, $120 million. The $100 million Nashville investment pays for itself before the building opens. Cost per employee, side-by-side graphic. Seattle versus Nashville. Here's the structural problem. Seattle and Washington State built their entire fiscal model on the assumption that high-wage employers would absorb the costs and stay, because during the tech boom years, the labor market was so concentrated in the city that there was genuinely nowhere else viable to go. That era ended. Remote work infrastructure, investment in secondary cities like Nashville and Austin, and direct state-level tax competition have made it operationally rational for a company like Starbucks to split its corporate footprint. and to keep only what is legally or logistically necessary in Seattle. The workers who organized were not wrong that their wages were too low relative to what Seattle costs. That cost of living was itself partly a product of the same policy environment their advocates created. The minimum wage drove up labor costs for small businesses, which reduced commercial activity, which contributed to the retail closures that tightened the housing and services market, which raised the cost of living for the workers. The wage increase was meant to help. That loop does not resolve itself through another round of escalation. Mayor-elect Wilson's picket line appearance on November 13, 2025, did not cause the Nashville announcement, but it was a data point, a signal. A city whose incoming mayor leads boycotts of its largest corporate tenant on the day she wins is a city sending an unambiguous message to its business community about its priorities. Starbucks had been watching Seattle for years. November 13th did not change their spreadsheet. It confirmed what was already on it. The NLRB filed complaints alleging Starbucks closed 23 stores nationwide in retaliation for union organizing. The company denied it. Starbucks Workers United said the NLRB findings backed their position. After 3 years and no ratified contract, that legal debate became academic. The stores were closed. The jobs were gone. One WARN notice. One document filed with the Washington State Employment Security Department on October 9, 2025. Behind it, 1,000 people in the Seattle metro who had been working for a company headquartered in their city since 1971, in a city that spent a decade telling them it was on their side. $100 million is now going to Nashville. 2,000 jobs are going to Nashville. And Mayor Katie Wilson, who stood outside the shuttered Reserve Roastery and told her city not to buy coffee from one of its largest employers, is now on record calling Starbucks a core part of Seattle's identity. The workers on that picket line were not wrong to want a contract. The city was not wrong to care about wages. If the workers at Starbucks had been given a fair contract in 2022, before the store closures, before the WARN notices, before Nashville, would any of this have gone differently? Leave your answer in the comments. If this kind of analysis is useful to you, subscribing keeps more of it coming.